At its most basic, photography is the art of exposure. Hi, I'm Ash Coyote, and today we're going to be talking about how to get the right exposure with your camera in our first ever episode of the Fundamentals of Fursuit Photography. Before we jump into getting the perfect exposure, we need to talk about the basics. On a camera, exposure is controlled by a combination of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor. The higher the number, the more noise that is introduced into your image. Shutter speed is the time at which the sensor is exposed and is usually expressed as a fraction. 1/50 would be a 1/50th of a second exposure. And finally, aperture is how much light reaches the sensor through the lens. The smaller the number, the larger the aperture, and thus the more light that reaches the sensor. For example, f1.4 is a very large aperture and allows for more flexibility when shooting in dim lighting conditions. The combination of these three elements is how we achieve exposure. So now let's talk about how and when to use them. Starting with ISO. ISO really allows for a lot of flexibility in how you choose to shoot. As an independent element of shutter and aperture, it allows you to finesse in your exposure more without having too much of an effect on the final image. Depending on the camera, a good rule of thumb that I use is to try and keep that number no higher than 1600 ISO. I find that higher than that can produce a far too grainy image, at least for my personal preferences. Usually for indoors, I shoot at 500 to 800 ISO, and outdoors I try and keep it around 100. Now let's talk about shutter speed. Have you ever taken a picture and it just came out super blurry? You know, like the colors were all smeared? This is because the shutter was too slow. You can use this to your advantage though for some really artsy stuff that we will talk about in a later episode. Shutter, as an element of exposure, controls the time at which the sensor is exposed to the light. So 1/50th of a second shutter would mean twice the amount of light reaching the sensor when compared to 1/100th of a second. Faster shutters, like 1/100th of a second and up, are good for moving subjects, and slower shutters like 1/50th of a second are better for static subjects. If you go below 1/30th of a second exposure, you are more likely to get some smearing in your photos. Last but not least, aperture. Aperture is the amount of light transmitted through the lens to the sensor. This variable is dependent on the quality and type of lens that you put on your camera. That's not to say that there aren't good cheap lenses though. Aperture is controlled by a series of interlocking blades within the lens itself, often referred to as an iris. Think like your eyes. And just like your eyes, the wider the iris, the more light comes in. Try looking in a mirror in a dimly lit room. Notice how your pupils get smaller when you turn on the lights? That is how our own body controls how we perceive the brightness of the space around us. Similarly, we can use aperture as a means to control how the camera sees the scene. When shooting in darker environments, using a wider aperture will result in a brighter image. Now, to apply all that knowledge. For today's shoot, we will be working with Chip. Wave to the camera, Chip! So, we will try two different environments, our front room and the backyard. In the front room, I will set up the camera by shooting a test exposure first. See how dark the image is? I may open up my aperture a bit and bump the ISO. Looks better, right? Now for the outside. Let's do the same thing as before and snap a test shot with our previous settings. Wowee, that's bright, right? So let's tone that exposure back a little by increasing our shutter and lowering the ISO. Much better. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, if you like what I do, please click subscribe.